It is the 41st millennium.
Hello folks. If you're interested in something more specific, then I have the following guides and I'm working on many more. Aside from that, in this guide we're covering the basic fundamentals of PvP, whilst explaining what that means specifically for each class, how each class should be typically played, and what they should bear in mind. For the basics of PvP, we have the following 5 factors: movement, positioning, resupplying, class strengths, and teamplay synergy. Starting with movement and positioning, this plays an important role for every class. Some excel whilst others not so much. Regardless, it's an important mechanic for every class. We need to be asking ourselves questions such as, by moving forward, are we pushing poorly covered ground? Can I account for any enemies I know or think are nearby? If I move here, where can I expect to be flanked from? Where can I retreat to? Etc. This will differ slightly depending on class. For tacticals, it's the most loose, as they have a plethora of weapons to choose from and can do well in all scenarios. They can effectively take all general advice for every other class and apply it in some way. They can take advantage of long sight lines. They can overwatch a team fight to support, or they can attempt to flank and push enemy backlines. In regards to class strengths, we excel at ranged combat. We can somewhat repel or counter flanks with our Auspex and 2 grenades. Both of these factors also make us great at pushing positions, supporting team fights, 1v1s, or otherwise just having lots of options in lots of situations. We should be making full use of our grenades and resupplying as often as possible. Having 2 grenades at our disposal is incredibly strong, and if team fights are taking place close to resupplies, then get throwing. Preferable targets are the Assault, Vanguard, and Sniper. They all have less armor than us, and the Assault lacks a primary weapon to fight back entirely. Overall, the Tactical is the most loose class, as it can do relatively well in most situations. It can take tips from almost every other class, and it offers the widest range of playstyles. For assaults, they are constantly looking for any position they can most effectively flank the enemy team. They should mostly avoid firefights and attempt to ambush every time. They should be paying close attention to enemy team positioning and picking their best flank option, whilst always being prepared to retreat and reapproach from alternative angles. For the Assault's class strengths, we have exceptional movement and melee, but inherently low armor and no primary weapon, meaning we should be looking to constantly hit and run enemies and utilizing our movement as much as possible. Movement is our best friend, and our hammer is a very close second. Learn and master the hammer. There are only 4 combos and they are all very strong. Assault has the highest skill ceiling in my opinion, due to it being outranged by every other class, and despite having a sidearm, and sidearms are very reliable, it will mostly want to get very adept at weaving in and out of battles, keeping alive, and flanking as often as possible. Bulwarks and heavies make for great targets, as our melee will deal with them easier than most classes can. This is especially true for Bulwarks. We are their best counter. Aim to eliminate them from team fights and your team will have an easier time. And lastly, I want to reiterate the focus on hit and run with this class. Oftentimes, if a flank fails, it can be more advantageous to reposition rather than pursue, as most enemies will otherwise be preparing for you to chase them down, and if they gain some distance and decent cover, you may have lost your advantage. Stay away from firefights unless you hold the advantage or have no other options, otherwise, surprise and bonk. For Vanguards, they are either constantly positioning into Overwatch and or vantage points. There are numerous positions that will have high traffic at certain times of matches, or if using the close range primary weapon, should be always looking to get into flanking positions on the enemy team. Using the grapnel to create shortcuts or keeping it ready to catch retreating enemies, or to counter in any fight. For class strengths, we have the ability to perch up high and pick our targets off. The grapnel does have crazy utility, and I wouldn't be able to explain it all here in time, but it's great for repositioning at a moment's notice, and it can quickly gain you advantageous positioning or get you out of trouble. Naturally, it's also great at locking individual targets down. Just be cautious of both your team and the enemy team's positioning, as this may be more detrimental to yourself than it is useful at times. Preferable targets are Bulwarks when using our grapnel. It's not a solid strategy without team support or a solid plan of execution, but it is effective. Next, we have other Vanguards, Assaults, and Snipers. We can trade quite well with other Snipers when using our rifle, and naturally we should keep Assaults at range and try to shoot them out of the sky. I found the most success with this class when overwatching a team fight and being prepared to grapnel in and support whenever needed. With low armor and limited primary options, we should be using cover as much as possible and mastering our grapnel for both offensive and utility purposes. Bulwark should be at the front of the pack, creating space for the team and pushing into enemy positions when appropriate. They are great for applying pressure, but balancing positioning is key, as being too close to your team for too long can allow for the enemy to gain a foothold. Being too far away will allow for the enemy team to overwhelm you. In terms of class strengths, naturally we have 4 armor slots and a shield to negate any damage coming from the front. The shield can block shots of allies standing close by, and our banner allows for huge sustain mid-team fight. We can appear very defensive at our core, but with good team presence and the right positioning, we can be just as deadly as any other class. Rotate between using your shield and gunning enemies down with your sidearm, and as opportunities present themselves, we can use the power sword to cleave through entire teams at times. Preferable targets are the heavy and the tactical, the heavy especially as they have practically nothing to deal with us and can oftentimes be singled out and murdered without team support. We do best when at the forefront of teamfights, and our power whirl ability with the power sword is possibly the single strongest melee attack in the entire game, capable of dealing with multiple enemies due to its wide swings, stun potential, and insane damage. The sniper should be either looking to rotate between long sight lines where they either overwatch or flank fire an enemy team. Alternatively, they should be constantly flanking by getting up close and behind the enemy with their SMG. Always be prepared to retreat and reposition if overwhelmed by multiple targets. Rifles typically do not do well when overwhelmed. For class strengths, naturally we have superior range. In most long-range gunfights, this should shine through. However, we should constantly be prepared for enemies trying to get close, as they know we have a disadvantage at this range. The sidearm makes for a very deceptive weapon when partnered with our cloak, as we can quickly secure good damage prior to the enemy being able to react. Bear this in mind when at close range and using rifles, as I've found the sidearm is more than able to hold its own when used correctly. When using our carbine SMG, however, we should constantly be flanking enemies from the back and weaving through teamfights whenever able to. We have insane DPS at very close range, and provided we stick to the hit and run formula, we shouldn't be allowing ourselves to get outnumbered or overwhelmed. Preferable targets are the assault, as we usually have very good vision and can shoot them out of the sky. When running either rifle or SMG, we should always aim to be as deceptive as possible with our cloak. It has a great range of uses and is one of my personal favourites. Lastly, the heavy is technically the slowest class when using their ADS, and thus should be positioning near cover and in semi-long sight lines to allow for instant fire on enemies the second they are revealed. Enemies will usually have to do more than just shoot at us in straight firefights, so always be prepared for enemies to come into melee range and or use grenades and abilities to deal with you. For class strengths, we have superior firepower and some good sustain in firefights with our Iron Halo. There is a core focus on being with our team at all times. It's not to say the heavy can't handle themselves when alone, but they have the most counters and will benefit the most from having a team around them. They make for very easy targets by bulwarks. When either playing a heavy or playing with a heavy, be aware of this. Countless times I've been abandoned by my team whilst attempting to fend up a bulwark. It's probably the most advantageous matchup in the entirety of Eternal War right now. There's very little options for a heavy outside of team support. Be aware of this regardless of class. To reiterate that last point for heavy, they rely so much on the team that constantly being positioned in and around your team is key. Overall, understanding your class's general role, how they should be positioned, and when and how to reposition will go a long way in your general gameplay, and identifying enemy classes, what they're likely trying to do, and how best to deal with them will all go a long way in terms of success within Eternal War. Grenades are a deadly resource in PvP. We won't dive into the specifics too much, but frag grenades are good for flushing enemies out of cover, can be bounced off surfaces and do decent damage in a somewhat easily avoidable blast radius. Crack grenades stick to the enemy, deal underwhelming damage but stagger upon explosion. They're a great counter to the Bulwark shield especially. Mountain bomb's main use is to kill, deter or weaken any enemies chasing you down. Useful for any class but shine most when used by the sniper or the assault. Lastly, we have the shot grenade. It's the all-round most solid option. It flashbangs anyone actually facing the explosion, has a damage over time and slow debuff area of effect. It's a great grenade and useful in almost any situation, and my personal go-to. Get savvy with every map's resupply locations. Ammo is in greater numbers and only necessary for those using specific weapons and or doing really well. But to reiterate again, learn these locations and aim to resupply between every engagement. Doing so has gone a long way towards my own success. The tactical class will gain 2 grenades whenever they resupply, so this makes this point even more valid for this class. The assault, vanguard and sniper classes will also often find themselves moving around the map slightly more than other classes. Get savvy with resupply locations and always use them. Team play is a huge factor within Eternal War. It's a 6v6 game mode at its core, and this means we can quickly find ourselves overwhelmed in team fights if we don't stick with our team correctly. Tactical should be in the team fights or countering any flanks of their own or their team's positions. Assault should be locating and disabling any enemies slightly separated from their team, or the Bulwarks and the Heavies providing their team support. Vanguard should be overwatching team fights and or flanking on decent sight lines or directly behind the enemy position. Bulwark should be creating space for the team during team fights and pressing into enemy positions whenever possible to allow for momentum to grow. The sniper should be mirroring the Vanguard to an extent and either setting up in good overwatch on team fights or flanking from either long sight lines or up close and behind the enemy team. Lastly, Heavy preferably wants to be front and center of the team fight, both delivering and receiving support. Alternatively, these can make for great overwatch units under the correct conditions, but will mostly shine best when supported by the team. A lot of these classes, if not all of them, can gel very well together, and I don't fancy diving into all of the specifics of each class pairing up with one another. Overall, team presence is very important, more important for some classes than others, but ultimately, we can't expect either ourselves or our team to do well if none of us stick together and the enemy team does. I can't stress enough how much games fall apart due to staggered spawns and no overall team positioning. If you're going in alone, maybe wait for the team to catch up before committing. If you're holding off and your team die, consider retreating and distracting as opposed to possibly dying and allowing the enemy team to dig in further. There's a lot more to Eternal War than just shoot first and don't miss shots. I think I've covered some of the most important elements for anyone either just getting in or who may not have much experience with the other classes outside of what they like. Regardless, I do plan to revisit the fundamentals again. I think the next episode will likely cover individual matchups and how each class should approach each map and game mode. Thanks for watching, folks. If you need anything more specific, then check out my channel. Otherwise, until next time, peace.